In this episode of OC Unsolved, we cover the disappearance of Flying Tiger Line Flight 739, a military flight across the Pacific. However, this one ended in tragedy, after the plane disappeared over the Western Pacific. But, with this one being a military flight, the possibilities are a bit more disturbing as to what may have happened. So, what caused this flight to vanish, and what role did the Viet Cong have in this? Let's get into it. By 1962, the United States was increasing its support to the Republic of Vietnam. As part of this, they were not just fighting the Viet Cong themselves, but also supporting the army of the Republic of Vietnam to take on the war themselves eventually. The United States sent advisors to the South to train them to continue to fight the Communists. As part of this, a company known as Flying Tiger Line was contracted by the US Army to fly advisors to South Vietnam. Operated as a military air transport service Flight 739, the plane for this flight was a Lockheed Super Constellation registered as November 6921 Charlie, with 17,224 airframe hours. It carried 11 civilian crew and 96 military personnel. Flown by Captain Gregory P. Thomas, First Officer Robert J. Wish, Second Officer Robbie G. Gazaway, Flight Engineers George M. Now and Clayton E. McClellan, and Navigator Grady R. Burt, Jr. Remember, back then, they had that many crew members instead of today, which is only 2. It also carried 93 military advisors on their way to relieve communication specialists who had been in Vietnam for quite some time, as well as 3 members of the South Vietnamese Army returning home from the USA. The plane left Travis Air Force Base at 5:45 GMT on March 12, 1962, bound for its refueling stops in Honolulu, Hawaii, Wake Island Airfield, and Andersen Air Base in Guam. The flight arrived at Guam at 12:41 GMT on March 14th. It took a long time due to delays in Honolulu and Wake about the plane's ignition systems and engines number 1 and 3. However, these were repaired and seen as not a major threat. The plane left Guam at 12:57 the same day, bound for Clark Air Force Base in the Philippines. It had an estimated arrival time in the Philippines of around 1916 GMT. It climbed to a cruising altitude of 18,000 feet and carried 9 hours of fuel for the 6-hour flight in case it had to divert. Their weather was good, and the forecast did not expect any turbulence at the planned altitude. 80 minutes after takeoff, they radioed Guam stating that they were 280 nautical miles, which is 520 kilometers or 320 miles, west of Guam. All sounded well, and the plane continued. However, Guam Air Force Base soon had issues with radio static, and when trying to contact the tower again, there was no response. The plane was never heard from again. When it failed to arrive at Clark Air Force Base, rescue operations were initiated. They declared the aircraft missing on the morning of the 16th. Search efforts commenced with no results, as the Navy, Air Force, Coast Guard, and Marines all ordered planes to search the area. After 2 weeks, the search was called off. The search was at the time the largest to ever take place in the Pacific and had covered more than 200,000 square miles. And with that, let's get into the theories. The first theory was sabotage. Since the plane was a military mission, it is possible someone could have exploded the plane. The Liberian tanker SSTL Lizen noticed a bright light fading from the sky about 90 minutes from the last known contact with the aircraft. The investigation said it was likely to be destroyed in an explosion, but could not say why. The investigation determined that crewmen aboard the tanker also observed what appeared to be vapor trails coming up after 2 fireballs fell into the ocean. The tanker proceeded to the location where the fireballs had been observed, but was unable to find any trace of the falling objects during their 6-hour search. It was theorized, though with no evidence, that a bomb was placed on the plane by the Viet Cong and used to blow up the plane. The aircraft was left unattended in a dimly lit area for a time while in Guam. However, they were only in Guam for just over 90 minutes. The Viet Cong was known for terrorist tactics, but this is only in the last few years of the war. The Flying Tiger line pushed this theory a lot, as it indicated that they were not at fault and that another source was the cause. They said nothing on board the plane was powerful enough to destroy the aircraft during normal operation. No evidence was gathered for a purposeful bombing, but it's the one that makes the most sense. The second theory is a fuel tank failure. Another interesting piece of evidence was the presence of vapor seen behind the explosion, suggesting a possible fuel tank explosion. There was the case of TWA Flight 891, a Lockheed Starliner, an improvement of the Super Constellation, which, shortly after taking off from Milan, Italy, in 1959, suffered a mid-air explosion and crashed. The Italian Court of Inquiry, assigned to investigate the crash, determined the lightning strike was to blame. It was therefore theorized that it could have caused the plane to crash, taking into account the stormy weather conditions. With frequent electric discharges existing in the area at the time of the crash, it may have been assumed the explosion of fuel vapors contained in the tank could have set off via electric discharge. The TWA crash had 2 explosions from 2 neighboring tanks. This is very similar to what the crew of the Lazen reported in regards to Flying Tiger Line Flight 739. There is an explosion, followed by another explosion. However, a fuel tank explosion would not have been sufficient to destroy the entire thing and would have left wreckage. The third theory is that it was abducted by aliens. The fourth theory is that it was a suicide bombing. For this, some military personnel would have had to keep the bomb with them for 30 hours in the plane, as the cargo doors were likely not opened in Guam. The flight was full, and so whoever did it would have had to conceal it inside a bag so no one would get suspicious. But who would do it? There were 3 South Vietnamese on the plane, but they would have likely wanted the Americans to prevent the Communist North from annexing South Vietnam. The only way this theory makes sense is if one of the military passengers was someone masquerading as an American or South Vietnamese soldier whose intentions were to blow up the plane. The incident report indicated the plane most likely blew up in midair, but could not find a reason for the explosion. It wrote, "A summation of all relevant factors tends to indicate the aircraft was destroyed in flight. However, due to the lack of any substantiating evidence, the board is unable to state with any degree to the certainty of the exact fate of November 6921 Charlie. The only way to figure out what happened is to go to the place where the SSTL Lizen saw the explosion, which, according to Google Maps, is over 15,000 feet below the waves. If the tail near the cargo hold is missing, that would explain the bombing. If the wing is missing, that would explain the fuel explosion." Over 60 years later, the vanishing of Flying Tiger Line Flight 738 continues to haunt the families of those who never made it home. With a missing plane, 107 dead, and a potential bombing, the vanishing of Flying Tiger Flight 739 remains unsolved.